Thank you very much for giving me the privilege of talking to you from a long distance. I would have really liked to be there in person. Unfortunately, I have been to Europe and back 3 times in the last 3 weeks, and this would have been the 4th time, and that would have ruined my summer holidays. So I was a bit selfish, but in the process, of course, I'm losing something really valuable, because what you're talking about in the context of gender and migration is really an underexplored subject, and yet a very important subject. And it's my loss that I'm not there. Thank you again for the privilege. I have a PowerPoint. You can see that, and if it does move, great. I would follow the sort of outline that I have put out there. Bit on migration and remittance trends worldwide. Then I would talk a little bit about the post-2015 development agenda, and related to the financing for development agenda as well. And I'll make sort of more layman's remarks, cursory remarks about gender and migration, reflecting more my ignorance of the subject, and perhaps my familiarity or the lack of it with the literature on this subject. I think the literature on this subject is not very developed, but I might be revealing my ignorance there. And finally, if I have time, I'll just introduce, make an introduction about the Global Knowledge Partnership on Migration and Development, that is the NOMAD, in my final final remarks. So on key messages, I would like you to sort of take away 3 key messages from my presentation: that there is a need for increased labor migration in the world due to income gaps, due to demographic pressures, but that long-term need contrasts against rising anti-immigration sentiments in recent times. The second key message is that migrant resources can be leveraged for financing development programs via remittances and diaspora bonds. And if we are thinking about post-2015 development agenda, or in general about the migration policy agenda globally, reducing the costs of migration, including recruitment costs, visa costs, passport costs, residency permits, the cost associated with that, that would be important. And that would, if we were able to reduce the costs of recruitment, costs of migration, then migrants' incomes would rise, and their ability to help families and friends back home would also increase. In that context, this could be a very useful post-2015 development goal. And of course, you have probably talked about it time and again now. There are important gender dimensions to migration that warrant attention. And one key element of that would be, in my view, substantive research to develop the gender dimension further. So those are sort of the 4 key messages that I want to leave you with in my presentation. Migration and remittance trends: 232 million international migrants, somewhere around 750 million internal migrants. So globally, about 1 billion people are migrants. That would be 1 out of 7 people in the world as migrants. That, of course, immediately puts things in perspective. If you are thinking about anything related to global development, then you ought to be thinking about migration as well, and about migrants as well. The bulk of migrants are economic migrants. They have migrated for economic purposes. They have migrated of their own volition. It's a voluntary migration. And because they are looking for a job and they have stayed, if they have stayed because of the job, there is an employer on the other side. And in this equal exchange, the migrants benefit, also the employers benefit. And of course, there are some losers, but there are more gainers than losers, more winners than losers in my perspective. International migrants are about 93% of international migrants are actually economic migrants. I suspect that the percentage of economic migrants in internal migration is even larger because there are not much mobility barriers. I think there is a lot more migration that takes place internally within borders for economic reasons. South-South migration, that means migration from developing countries to other developing countries, is actually larger than South-North migration, that is migration from developing countries to high-income, rich countries. And this type of migration, South-South migration, will increase in the future because of the the income gaps we talked about, because of the demographic pressures we talked about. Remittances sent by migrants have been growing strongly, and now they're about 3 times the size of official aid. That is shown in this slide. The red line shows the evolution of remittances since the 1990s, and remittances are then compared against foreign direct investment. That's sort of the yellow line or orangish line. I don't know what color you see there. And that is compared with private debt and portfolio equity flows, the green line, and then the official development assistance, the line below, light blue color. What you see from this chart is the enormous size of remittances, $404 billion flowing to developing countries as remittances, as officially recorded remittances last year. The true size of remittances, including unrecorded flows, is even larger. The other remarkable feature from this chart is the stability of remittances, and especially during the global financial crisis, only a small decline was registered in remittances. It was only a 5% decline in the year 2009, and a quick recovery to pre-crisis level, pre-global crisis levels, and then a resumption of growth. Going forward, we expect remittances to continue to grow at a clip of about 8 to 10%, just short of 10% annual rate of growth. And indications are that it will continue to grow in that fashion for a while to come. Again, as I mentioned, the data shown here are only about officially recorded data. Even at that level, remittances are about 3 times the size of official development assistance. And this is a remarkable fact that ought to be noticed in the context of financing for development.
An idea now, but please continue.
Thank
obviously
you.
Sorry.
Great. In terms of long-term outlook, we know that migration will continue to rise. South-South migration will rise, but in the near to medium term, we have rising anti-immigration sentiment in Europe. Of course, you are right there, but actually it is all over the world. It is in the US, it is in Australia, it is in Saudi Arabia, it is in India, it is in Russia, it is in South Africa. This is really worrisome. And the worries of the past, which were more of sort of non-tangible worries, now are actually being translated into deportations, into actual action of keeping people out there. And that will have huge repercussions in terms of remittance flows to developing countries, as well as long-term in terms of meeting the needs to create employment opportunities, the need to have the global labor market function better going forward. That is a major worry that remains. And one indication of that is, for example, a fall in recent months in remittances to Bangladesh, which is probably directly a result of deportations from Saudi Arabia, and to an extent, their tightening of taking on migrants, hiring migrants from Bangladesh, migrant workers from Bangladesh in Saudi Arabia. So these are some really worrisome trends. And in this context, of course, women and children are quite vulnerable, and they face special risks when there is anti-immigration problems rising all over the world. In the context of the post-2015 development agenda, there are several links between migration and development. We talked about remittances, but in addition, there is philanthropy, there is investment in entrepreneurship, the skills, knowledge and technology transfers, trade, tourism, values and advocacy. I think in this context, we have some understanding of women and remittances, how that might differ from the remittance patterns, remittance behavior of men. Some actually more anecdotal evidence than real evidence. Very little evidence on philanthropy, very little evidence on investment and entrepreneurship. On values and advocacy, there is a bit of literature on that involving women, in particular impacts on fertility. There are some papers on that, and impact on school dropout rates, which basically show that women actually transmit those values to their countries of origin. Possible migration-specific goals in the post-2015 development agenda: reduce the cost of remittances. Of course, the cost reduction target has to go beyond the 5% target that the G20 has supported, because we are talking about long-term goals here, about 2030 perhaps. And if we are thinking about the long term, with the technological trends going the way they are, remittance costs could actually fall to close to zero. Definitely, we should have a target of reducing remittance cost to below 1%. Also, we could mobilize additional resources for financing for development through remittances as well as diaspora savings, and reducing the costs of recruitment in particular, but also cost of visa, cost of passports could be very useful goals for the post-2015 development agenda. And in that context, an important tool to monitor and advocate the cost reduction would be a bilateral matrix of recruitment costs. And of course, a goal that cannot be ignored is the protection of rights and safety of migrants, especially of women and minors. I wouldn't talk much about remittance costs. I wouldn't talk much about diaspora bonds now, but if there are questions, we can take it up later. Just to mention that on recruitment costs tend to be very high and regressive. Poor people, low-skilled migrants, they tend to pay much higher costs than, let's say, doctors and nurses and investment bankers. And these costs can be prohibitive. For example, in this slide, if you have a handout, you can take a look at it even later. You see that a Bangladeshi worker working in the construction sector in the Middle East is probably paying close to $3,000 on average as recruitment costs. That's about 15 months of expected wages of the Bangladeshi migrant. Anecdotally, I have seen numbers, recruitment cost numbers, that amount to 36 months or 48 months of expected wages for a number of construction workers in Dubai, in Abu Dhabi. And that is simply not acceptable. We need to reduce these costs, and there are easier ways to do it. It's really a low-hanging fruit if you're thinking about helping migrants and their ability to help their countries of origin. So reducing recruitment costs would be a very important goal. Key gender dimensions of migration, in particular on remittances, a few things that one can make remarks about, but you probably have talked a lot about this, so I'll be very quick on this. The gender discrimination issue is very serious in the case of migrants who are already vulnerable, who already are sort of falling through the cracks in many parts of the world. They don't have rights, and whether it is employment, workplace abuse, whether it is in terms of access to services, in particular health services, women are quite vulnerable. They are usually excluded much more than male migrants. On remittance behavior, the anecdotal evidence is that women earn less, but they send a larger portion of their remittances home. In terms of channels, they tend to choose channels that are much more trustworthy, even if they might be higher cost. And in terms of who they send money to, they tend to send money to a larger group of people than men. So these are some of the anecdotal evidence we have found from some surveys. The surveys were not representative, so we can't really use them very effectively, but something to pay attention to. And of course, in terms of vulnerability to trafficking and abuse, domestic violence included, female migrants are especially vulnerable, and they are much more so in GCC countries and, well, in all those societies we know of. I'm not going to name names. A couple of words about the finally Global Knowledge Partnership on Migration and Development. It is a knowledge initiative, an open, inclusive, multidisciplinary knowledge initiative. It's a partnership. We are working with the Global Migration Agencies, which means about 18 mostly UN agencies, also the International Organization for Migration, also the OECD, and we are open to partnership with the civil society players as well. And it is a global public good intended to disseminate policy-oriented knowledge, evidence-based knowledge, and it would have the quality of a journal in terms of a peer-reviewed journal in terms of quality, rigor, but it would be completely policy-oriented, and the goal is to create a menu of policy options for migration and development policymakers. That includes Part 1 countries as well as Part 2 countries, meaning rich countries as well as poor countries, sending countries as well as receiving countries, as well as transition countries. So it is truly global in nature. There are 12 thematic working groups that span the whole spectrum of migration and global development. And then there are 4 cross-cutting themes. One theme that we are about to introduce into the global, to the Nomad framework is the theme of forced migration. And we are hoping to collaborate with UNHCR in that theme because of the significant increase in forced migration of late. So that's where we are, and let me stop there. Thank you.
Wow, fantastic. Thank you very much. I'm going to use the chair's prerogative for the first time to actually ask a question of my own. And also, I'm even going to be flexible about the schedule, which is very unlike me, and suggest that we take 2 or 3 questions from the floor for Dilip, whilst the next panelists come and sit at this table, if that's okay. And my question to you, Dilip, was really, given a group of us in this room who have been talking about emphasis, about the role of women and migration, both in South Asia and from insights from the rest of the world, and we are a group of 100 people in this room and then 100 people online from various NGOs and charities and international organizations. What do you think we should be, what are the key messages that you think that we should be focusing on in the next 6 months to have impact on the 2015 agenda? So that was a question from me, and I'm looking around to see if anybody's catching my eye, if they have any questions that they'd like to pose themselves. Okay, well, over to you, Dilip.
Thank you. As I mentioned, I would suggest 3 goals and 3 plus 1. Let's put it that way. We can't say to countries to open up borders. That would be nice if we were able to do that. A lot of problems would go away if we open up borders, but we can't say that. What we can say, though, is to reduce the cost of migration, reduce the cost of remittances, which is already a G20 goal. that's easier to do. But going beyond that, to reduce the cost of recruitment of low-skilled workers, in particular domestic workers, construction workers, and agricultural workers, we have to have focus. We shouldn't just open it up too wide. And in terms of a monitoring tool, the bilateral recruitment cost matrix I talked about, similarly, we can also create a bilateral visa cost matrix. And of course, then you can think about passport costs as well. So that would be sort of the metric to go with the first goal of reducing recruitment cost. Reducing remittance cost, we already have a bilateral matrix, the Remittance Prices Worldwide database, which has had a lot of impact. And costs are falling in high cost, high volume corridors, remittance corridors. Remittance costs are still very high in low volume corridors, and in particular in sub-Saharan Africa, where I think most of the corridors are low volume corridors. Because as you know, in sub-Saharan Africa, you have about 900 million people with 47 or 48 countries now. So that actually fragments the market. The third goal, so we talked about reducing remittance costs. Second goal, reducing recruitment costs and migration costs, so visa costs and all. The third one is improving the rights of migrants, and that especially applies to women. And the final point, which is sort of more not directly a goal, but something that is useful to keep in the context of post-2015 agenda, is the financing for development agenda, where remittances can help. Also, diaspora savings could be mobilized in significant numbers for financing for development. And some statistics that we have put together more recently, we will have a brief coming out soon, I hope, even as early as next week, showing that with 232 million international migrants, if there were a nation comprising only of international migrants, that would be the 5th largest country in the world in terms of population. It will be larger than Brazil. So after China, India, US, and Indonesia, the migrant nation will be the 5th largest. If you were looking at GDP, national income that is, then a migrant nation comprising of international migrants alone would have a GDP, a national income level of $2.6 trillion in 2012. $2.6 trillion economy would be the 6th largest economy in the world, larger than UK economy, a bit smaller than the France economy. If out of this $2.6 trillion, only 20% were saved by migrants, the average saving rate in the developing world is 21%. National saving rate in developing countries, the average is 21%. Okay, let's say that migrants bring their saving habits to the destination countries. If they were to save only 1/5, then the saving annually would be $511 billion. Most of this money is parked in saving accounts in the UK, in Europe, in the US, in Canada, well, in many countries. The dollar interest rate on these accounts is these days 0. If you were to offer an investment opportunity and offer 3% interest rate or 4% interest rate, I think a whole number of migrants would buy into those bonds. And then you are talking about huge amounts of development funding that could be raised. So I hope I sort of answered your question, or maybe I missed the point completely.
Absolutely, and
please let me know.
I'm not sure if you're getting any of the feedback from the room, but there's a lot of murmurs of interest that I'm picking up. So I guess it just is left to me to say a very sincere and heartfelt thank you for joining us. I know it's much earlier in DC than it is here, so you have a lovely day and a great weekend. And again, thanks very much for all of us at the conference. A last round of applause.
Thank you.